It is the winter of 1944, somewhere on the road between the town of Auschwitz and the death camp of Birkenau, and a line of men is walking through the snow in the dark. There are perhaps 200 of them. They are prisoners of the Monowitz labor camp, worked to the edge of collapse building a synthetic rubber plant for a German chemical company, and tonight they have been selected. Selected means they are too weak to keep working. Selected means Birkenau, 5 miles away, where the chimneys never stop, and the smell reaches the whole valley on the wrong kind of wind. SS guards count the column at the gate before it leaves. They will count it again when it arrives. The numbers have to match, every single time, because in a system built on the industrial logic of destruction, the one thing that cannot be allowed to happen is a body going missing from the ledger. A missing body means a question. A question means an investigation, and for the guards responsible, an investigation could mean a transfer to the Eastern Front. Except tonight, one is missing anyway. Somewhere in that column, a man who was supposed to die tonight has walked out of the line and is now standing somewhere else entirely, carrying a name in his pocket that used to belong to somebody else, somebody who is no longer alive to need it back. Behind him, near the camp fence, a corpse is being dressed in his old uniform, his old number stitched onto the striped cloth. When the guards count the bodies at Birkenau, the number will match the number that left Monowitz. On paper, nobody escaped. On paper, nobody was saved. The man who arranged this is not Jewish. He is not, in the strictest sense, even a prisoner of this camp at all. He is a British soldier, a prisoner of war protected on paper by the Geneva Convention, free to walk through parts of the site that no concentration camp inmate could ever reach without being shot for it, and he has just spent a chocolate bar and a tin of coffee to buy the identity papers off a dead man. His name is Charles Coward. The Jewish prisoners in the camp had already given him a nickname of their own. They called him the Count of Auschwitz, because a man who moved as freely as he did, who talked to armed guards like he owned the ground under their boots, had to be something more than what his uniform said he was. By the time the war ended, he would be credited with saving more than 400 lives using nothing but forged paperwork and the sheer nerve to keep doing it, week after week, inside one of the most heavily guarded murder sites in human history, and outside a small circle of historians and a British television audience in 1960, almost nobody has ever heard his name. This is his story. Some parts of it are beyond dispute, documented in trial transcripts, government archives, and sworn legal testimony given decades apart. Other parts come only from his own post-war account, and this video is going to be honest about which is which. But even stripped down to only the undisputed facts, Charles Coward's war is one of the strangest and most quietly defiant stories to come out of the Holocaust, and it starts not at Auschwitz, but on a beach outside Calais, 4 years earlier, with a British Army quartermaster about to become one of the worst prisoners the German army ever had the misfortune of capturing. Charles Joseph Coward was born in 1905 in Edmonton, a working-class corner of North London that was not in the business of producing gentlemen officers. It produced tradesmen, dock workers, and soldiers who joined up because the army offered a wage and a way out. Coward was not, by any account of people who knew him, a natural rule follower. He talked fast, thought faster, and had an instinct, almost a compulsion, for finding the gap in any system placed in front of him, whether that system was a ration book, a customs form, or eventually a concentration camp's method of keeping count of its own prisoners. He joined the British Army as a young man, and by the time war broke out again in September 1939, he was a quartermaster battery sergeant major with the 8th Reserve Regimental Royal Artillery, a supply and logistics man who spent his career learning exactly how paperwork moves through a bureaucracy, who checks it, who doesn't, and how easily it can be manipulated by somebody patient enough to understand the system from the inside. In May 1940, the German invasion of France and the Low Countries tore through the Allied line faster than anyone on the Allied side had planned for, and while the bulk of the British Expeditionary Force scrambled toward the beaches at Dunkirk, a smaller and far less remembered defense was fought 30 miles up the coast at the port of Calais. The garrison there, badly outnumbered and cut off from resupply, was given a single brutal task: hold the port as long as possible so the German divisions converging on it could not be redirected toward Dunkirk while the evacuation was still underway. They held 4 days against overwhelming armor and artillery, fighting street to street as the perimeter shrank, buying critical time for tens of thousands of men to get off the beaches instead. Calais finally fell on May 25, 1940, and several thousand British soldiers who had held the line went into German captivity in a single day. Charles Coward was one of them. What happened next tells you almost everything about what kind of prisoner the German army had just acquired. Most captured soldiers, understandably and reasonably, settled in to wait out the war as safely as circumstances allowed. Coward tried to escape twice before he had even reached a permanent camp, slipping away during transport in the chaotic early days of captivity, when guard numbers were thin. Once he was properly behind the wire, he tried 7 more times, 9 escape attempts in total, across multiple camps, every one ending in recapture, and every one apparently doing nothing whatsoever to discourage him from trying again the next chance he got. Each failed attempt typically meant transfer to a stricter facility with tighter security, the German system's version of a disciplinary escalation ladder, and Coward simply kept climbing it. One of those attempts produced what might be the strangest true story in any Allied prisoner's war record. Wounded during a breakout, Coward spoke fluent German well enough to pass, and when picked up by a German field hospital, presented himself as a wounded German soldier separated from his unit. The doctors treated him without ever suspecting who he was. Moved by what they took to be quiet bravery, the hospital recommended him for a decoration, and Charles Coward, a British sergeant major, was awarded the Iron Cross by the very army holding him prisoner. He was recaptured not long after, technically still the bearer of a German military honor he was never supposed to have. It sounds invented for a film, and yet it is one of the better corroborated details of his biography. Coward was, by any definition, a gifted con artist with a genuine talent for exploiting the gap between what a uniform claimed about a person and what was actually true. In December 1943, Coward was transferred to a labor detachment called E715, a sub-camp of Stalag VIE B holding around 1,400 British prisoners of war. What made it different from every other camp he had passed through was its location. A few hundred meters from a concentration camp complex the world would come to know as Auschwitz. Auschwitz was never one place. Auschwitz I was the administrative headquarters. Auschwitz II, Birkenau, was the extermination camp itself, built with gas chambers and crematoria to kill on an industrial scale with no real precedent. And Auschwitz III, Monowitz, was a slave labor camp built by the German chemical conglomerate IG Farben to construct a synthetic rubber and fuel plant the Nazi war economy desperately needed, worked by concentration camp prisoners for as long as their bodies could sustain the output. IG Farben was not a fringe operation. It was one of the largest chemical conglomerates on Earth, and its own internal planning documents, later produced as evidence at Nuremberg, treated concentration camp labor as simply another line item in the budget, a resource to be drawn from and replaced as prisoners died or became too weak to continue. When a prisoner's body could no longer meet that bar, Birkenau's trains and marches ran 5 miles down the road, constantly. The British prisoners of E715 worked daily alongside Monowitz's concentration camp prisoners on the same construction site, separated not by distance, but by legal status. A British soldier had rights under the Geneva Convention. A Jewish concentration camp prisoner had none. The Germans permitted Red Cross parcels to reach the British POWs, and something resembling an ordinary prisoner of war existence, sitting close enough to an entirely different and far more lethal system that the two groups could see, hear, and in documented cases, quietly assist one another. Because Coward spoke fluent German, he was appointed the camp's man of confidence, the Red Cross liaison responsible for representing British prisoners to the German administration. It was an unglamorous post that happened to come with something close to genuine freedom of movement. Coward could speak to guards without automatically drawing suspicion, move between sections of the site, and receive and distribute Red Cross parcels, giving him regular access to a form of currency that had all but vanished from wartime Europe: real chocolate, cigarettes, and coffee, worth more to a desperate guard than money. What he saw from that position is not in dispute. Trains arrive daily, carrying between 1,500 and 2,000 people at a time, overwhelmingly Jewish, in 1944 drawn heavily from the mass deportations out of Hungary. SS personnel conducted selections directly on the platform, dividing arrivals into those judged strong enough to work and those who were not. Those who failed went straight to Birkenau, often within hours. Coward would later state under oath that he and the other British prisoners knew precisely what the gas chambers were for and roughly where they stood. It was happening within walking distance of their own barracks, every day, for month after month. The timing of his posting matters here. He arrived at E715 in December 1943, and the deportations he would have witnessed at their most overwhelming came in the spring and summer of 1944, when the Germans organized the deportation of Hungary's Jewish population with a speed that shocked even hardened camp administrators. In roughly 8 weeks between May and July of that year, close to 430,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz, a surge that arrived almost exactly when Coward did. According to Coward's own account, first published in a 1954 memoir titled "The Password is Courage," this dangerous proximity became the foundation of a rescue operation. Using the chocolate, cigarettes, and coffee flowing through Red Cross channels, he bribed German guards for access to the identity papers of prisoners who had recently died, specifically non-Jewish prisoners, whose papers would draw less scrutiny. With a dead man's papers in hand, he would get them to a Jewish inmate marked for the next transport to Birkenau. That inmate would take on the dead man's identity and vanish into a different classification. Meanwhile, the actual corpse, dressed in the uniform and number of the man just saved, would be left among the dead to be tallied in his place. To the guards counting bodies at the end of the road, the arithmetic worked out perfectly. Nobody, on paper, had escaped anything. It is an audacious, almost absurdly simple scheme once you strip it down to its mechanics, built not on smuggled weapons or a dramatic breakout under fire, but on the single greatest structural vulnerability inside an industrial killing machine. A system that depends entirely on paperwork being accurate is a system that can be beaten by anyone with the access and the nerve to make the paperwork lie. Coward, by every account including the skeptical ones, possessed an unusual abundance of both. He is credited, through this method, sustained over roughly a year of contact with the camp, with saving more than 400 lives. Now, here is where honesty matters more than a satisfying number. This exact figure, and the full scale of the scheme as it has been told for 7 decades, comes almost entirely from Coward's own post-war account. Historians affiliated with the Wollheim Memorial, an archive dedicated to the documented history of Buna-Monowitz, have noted that surviving former British POWs and later research contain genuinely skeptical assessments of the full extent of what Coward described. Some of his more dramatic claims, including that he helped smuggle weapons to resistance fighters inside Birkenau, have been specifically questioned by historians unable to corroborate them independently. It is entirely possible, and in the assessment of some researchers likely, that a genuinely remarkable and dangerous true story grew somewhat larger in the retelling over the years, whether through the ordinary and well-documented distortions of human memory, recalling events a decade later, through the commercial demands of a 1950s publishing market with a real appetite for uncomplicated heroic war stories, or through some combination of both. None of this is unique to Coward. It is a documented hazard of relying on any single memoir, written a decade after the fact, as a primary historical source, and serious historians treat it as a reason for careful reading rather than a reason to dismiss the account altogether. What is not in dispute is still considerably more than most people accomplish in a lifetime. Coward's position as man of confidence at E715 is documented administrative fact. His fluency in German and resulting freedom of movement is documented fact. His proximity to and first-hand knowledge of the Monowitz-Birkenau system, including the location and function of the gas chambers, is documented fact, confirmed independently by sworn legal testimony given years later, testimony that predates the 1954 memoir entirely and carried real legal weight rather than commercial incentive. That sworn testimony, delivered under oath at an international war crimes tribunal with real consequences riding on its accuracy, describes precisely the kind of camp conditions and detailed knowledge of the killing apparatus that make the broader rescue account, even in its less verifiable specifics, entirely plausible rather than fabricated from nothing. This video presents Coward's rescue scheme largely as it has been told for 70 years, because it is the reason anyone remembers his name today, while being upfront, in the way this channel tries to be with every story it tells, that the precise figure of 400 lives saved is his own claim, repeated by nearly every source that followed him, not an independently audited number. What happened to Coward afterward is not in question, because it happened in the full light of an international legal record. On August 20th, 1944, the United States Army Air Force carried out its first bombing raid on the IG Farben complex at Monowitz, part of a wider Allied campaign targeting the synthetic fuel and rubber production the German war machine could not function without. One of the bombs fell not on the factory floor, but directly on the British POW camp beside it. E-715 had no adequate air raid shelter, nothing built to withstand a direct hit from the air. 39 British prisoners of war were killed in that single strike. Men who had already survived years of German captivity, killed in the end, not by the guards who held them, but by bombs dropped by their own side's air force. It is a detail that resists any tidy narrative about who exactly the villains and heroes were in that stretch of occupied Poland. War rarely organizes itself around clean moral lines, even inside a story this clear-cut in almost every other respect. The war in Europe ended in early May 1945, and Coward, along with the surviving prisoners of E-715, was liberated and eventually made his way home to England through the chaotic post-war repatriation system. He settled back into ordinary civilian life at 133 Chichester Road in Edmonton, the very same working-class neighborhood he had grown up in, together with his wife Florence and their 5 children. For nearly 2 years, the man who had spent the winter and spring of 1944 forging dead men's identity papers to save strangers from a death camp went back to being, as far as anyone around him could tell, an entirely anonymous London husband and father, the kind of man nobody on his street would have guessed had a story like this sitting behind him. That changed in 1947, when the Allies put IG Farben's own leadership on trial as part of the wider Nuremberg proceedings, prosecuting executives for war crimes connected to slave labor at Monowitz. Charles Coward was called as a prosecution witness. On July 24, 1947, he gave a sworn affidavit describing the daily train arrivals and the SS selection process. On November 13th, he testified in person about conditions inside Monowitz and the specific locations of the gas chambers. His testimony became part of a much larger body of prosecution evidence used to establish that IG Farben's civilian leadership knew with precision exactly what their factory was built beside, and exactly whose forced labor was keeping their production lines running. Several executives were convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to prison terms, one of the first times in modern history a corporation's own leadership had been held individually and criminally accountable in an international tribunal for what their company had done in service of a genocide. IG Farben itself did not survive the verdict intact. The Allied powers formally dissolved the conglomerate in the years that followed, breaking it back apart into a number of smaller, separate chemical companies, a corporate fragmentation intended to ensure that the specific institutional entity which had built a factory beside a death camp would never again exist as a single organization with that history attached to its name. Coward was not finished testifying. In 1953, a former Monowitz prisoner named Norbert Wollheim, who had lost his wife and 3-year-old son at Auschwitz, brought a landmark civil lawsuit against IG Farben, seeking financial compensation for his own forced labor, one of the earliest and most consequential legal attempts anywhere in the world to hold a corporation directly accountable for its role in the Holocaust. It is remembered today as an early foundation stone for the modern concept of corporate reparations for atrocity. Coward testified again, under oath, to what he had personally seen and known nearly a decade earlier. Separately, records from around E715 indicate Wollheim was among the prisoners who developed unusually close contact with the British POWs stationed nearby, receiving donated clothing and, on occasion, having letters smuggled out to the wider world through British hands. A smaller and quieter version of the same basic dynamic that ran through everything Coward is remembered for. 7 years later, in 1960, Coward was the subject of the popular British program This Is Your Life, ambushed by host Eamon Andrews, and walked through the story of his war in front of a studio audience. A fellow former prisoner, Cecil Sclan, paid tribute to him on camera. Sitting in that same audience was Norbert Wollheim, watching a former British sergeant major be publicly celebrated for what he had risked at Monowitz. 3 years after that broadcast, in 1963, Yad Vashem formally named Charles Coward one of the righteous among the nations, the highest honor Israel bestows on non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust, an honor that requires independent investigation before it is ever awarded. Coward was the first British citizen ever to receive it. A tree was planted in his honor along the Avenue of the Righteous in Jerusalem, standing today alongside those of Oskar Schindler and a small, carefully vetted list of others whose claims have been formally examined and confirmed, rather than simply taken on faith. Yad Vashem has, since the program began, formally recognized somewhere in the range of 28,000 individuals as righteous among the nations, drawn from a wartime population of hundreds of millions living under German occupation across the whole of Europe. It is, by design, an extremely narrow needle to thread, precisely because the honor is meant to mean something verifiable, rather than simply celebrate a good story. Charles Coward died on December 21, 1976, at 71, in the same Edmonton house he had returned to more than 3 decades earlier. For most of the years in between, he had lived as an entirely ordinary Londoner, not a public figure, simply a husband and father of 5 who had once talked his way past armed guards with a chocolate bar. In 2003, English Heritage placed a blue plaque on his former home. In 2010, the British government posthumously named him a British hero of the Holocaust. There is something worth sitting with in the specific shape of what Charles Coward's war actually looked like. He did not storm a beach or silence a machine gun nest. He fought the single largest, most bureaucratically organized system of mass murder ever constructed, using precisely the tools that system depended on to run smoothly: paperwork, counting, and the assumption that a number written on a page reflects the truth underneath it. A working-class Londoner with a lifelong talent for talking his way around authority figures, a man who had once fooled a German field hospital into decorating him for bravery he hadn't shown to them at all, found himself standing close enough to touch the machinery of genocide, and instead of simply surviving it as a bystander with a Red Cross card in his pocket, he apparently spent chocolate bars on dead men's identity papers until the machine's own arithmetic began quietly working against it, one swapped name at a time. Whether the true number of lives he changed was 400, or something more modest lost to memory and a publisher's appetite for a clean story, the undisputed core of who Charles Coward was remains untouched by that question. He was captured at Calais and tried to escape 9 times rather than wait out the war. He talked his way to an Iron Cross from the army holding him prisoner. He stood close enough to Auschwitz for the better part of a year to know exactly what it was, and testified against the corporation that built it, not once but twice, under oath, on a record that carried real consequences and offered him no commercial benefit whatsoever. And an institution built specifically to separate genuine wartime rescuers from comfortable post-war mythology examined his case and put his name on a tree in Jerusalem anyway, the first British name on that list. It is worth noticing what Coward's story has in common with some of the other stories this channel has told, and what sets it apart. Like Georg Duckwitz slipping a warning to the Danish resistance, or Chiune Sugihara handwriting visas against direct orders from his own government, Coward's rescue depended on nothing more dramatic than access, paperwork, and the willingness to keep making the same dangerous choice over and over, instead of just once. But unlike either of those men, Coward was never a diplomat with any institutional protection behind him. He was an enlisted soldier with no official standing inside the camp, a prisoner himself in every legal sense that mattered, whose only real leverage was a chocolate ration and a talent for talking that had already once fooled an entire German field hospital. He went home afterward to Edmonton, to Florence and their 5 children, and lived out an unremarkable, ordinary life, until an old episode of a television show and a small, easily walked past blue plaque became almost the only public reminders left that a quartermaster battery sergeant, Major once made a habit of walking into the deadliest place in occupied Europe like he owned the ground underneath it, and made sure, again and again, that the numbers never quite added up the way the guards at the gate believed they did. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.